Welcome to the Measure Success podcast, where I talk with top leaders about effective strategies that inspire success. Very excited to have with us Dr. Michael Gerharz. He is a communication expert and recent author of The Path to Strategic Impact, which we'll talk a lot about today. And also he has the Irresistible Communication podcast as well. Michael, welcome to the Measure Success podcast.
Welcome, Carl. Great to be here.
So let's get right into the book, because I think it's a really interesting discussion. First of all, what drove you to write a book? Being an author myself, and not like I've written many things, and I know this is your second book, but what drove you to write this book? What inspired you?
Well, first of all, I think part of my life is just writing. So I write a daily blog since very long ago, and so that just is kind of the natural extension to that. So what's great about blogging is that it forces you to capture the moments that you pay attention to and then find words to make sense of them. But what blogs are not good at is framing them as a concise, bigger concept. That's what books are for, right? And so over time, some patterns started to emerge, like those 4 fundamental principles that I talk about in the book, but also some patterns that I saw with my clients, right? That there's that continuing struggle to actually make sense of the strategy and to actually make good use of the hard work that they put into crafting their strategy. And so I thought that the time was right to actually frame that as a bigger thought rather than spread it out over weeks or months of smaller blog posts, so that we have a chance to actually read this in a sitting, for example, from a coast to coast flight, and just make a little more sense of the strategies that we come up with.
That's right. And once again, if people aren't familiar with Dr. Gerharz, he is actually based in Cologne, Germany. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I always am impressed with our foreign friends who come onto the show, and I feel like they speak English better than I do. So thank you. And I'm just always impressed with people who have done amazing things and have an impact. And what's fun about this for you too, you said your book beforehand was more for German readers, but this is intended for the global audience. You mentioned you had some really interesting responses already to your book. And that's always really exciting, right? When people say, wow, great job, congratulations. What if some of if you make common comments or remarks that people have said who have read the book?
I think what feels good about those comments is that they have one common thread, is that this is actually the problem that we all have. This is a real struggle that we have, and we haven't found a good book on that yet. So that this is the book that's still missing in the strategy domain. There's a ton of books about how to craft a great strategy. There's a ton of books about execution and how to set up the processes and stuff like that. But nothing, or close to nothing, that bridges the gap. So you have that strategy. How do you get the team to understand it? And so if you just search on Amazon, there's nothing about that. And so I thought that it would make sense to write that book, and the comments from readers just proved me right there, that this is actually a struggle that they're facing. And what people like about the book is how actionable they found it, so that this is not just theory. This is just directly applicable to their work.
What I'm excited as we dive more into this book today during the podcast is one of the things I think that's missed often from leaders, is especially CEOs, is they come up with a plan and they're already there because they've been thinking about it for a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years, but finally they got a few other leaders together in a room to quote unquote come up with a strategic plan. Yeah. And then they'll say it one time in a meeting, and maybe even send the document out and say, now let's go execute. And people have no idea what they're talking about. They have, especially if it's a significant change, right? They have no idea, no understanding. curious for you and your research and what you've seen and experienced. Is that true? Is that a common challenge of this gap of the leader and the employees, if you may, who are trying to follow this change?
That's absolutely spot on. That is one of the major issues. Strategy is often considered to be that thing that upper management does or leadership does, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? Because let's face it, the ones who have to actually do the work, have to actually make the choices, take the actions based on that strategic directions. These are the tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands employees spread across the entire organization. And unless we make them get it and make sense of it, all that brilliance that sounded so smart and probably was really smart in the boardroom, all that effort is just wasted time because, well, people cannot execute on that, cannot take the actions, cannot make the choices.
It is. And I appreciate your once again your experience around that, because it's often something I see. They say, you're familiar with McKinsey and the large consulting firms, and one of the most staggering statistics, despite the billions of dollars that's spent on these large consulting firms, only 20% of their plans actually get implemented. But of course, you and I both know nobody gets fired for hiring McKinsey. It's kind of the old standing joke,
Exactly,
right?
yeah.
It's hey, we just validated that this could work, this could be true. But of course, nothing ends up. Oh well, only 20% of the time, 1 out of every 5 times, is actually get implemented. Once again, going further on that, why? Why? How? When we bring in like literally the smartest people in the world, some of them, right, to come in and give us this idea, and it stops again 4 out of 5 times it fails. Why is that?
The thing is that, well, that the strategy itself isn't the problem. It's actually smart. McKinsey and all the others, and probably the C-suite, they know what they're doing. The books have been written. That is not rocket science anymore. It is rather clear how to craft a great strategy. The problem is what happens after we've made the strategy. So in my book, there is that little self-assessment that readers can take. And I've been observing it since the book came out. And in it, the first question that I ask you is, can your team members say in plain and simple words what the core of your strategy is? And less than a third of the responses that I collected there said that they can do that. And then a further question sometimes later in that assessment is, so do they know what so given that they know that, understand it, do they know what it means for the everyday choices and the actions that they need to take? And it's less than a quarter. So it's that translation that fails. The problem is that communication is an afterthought, so that we have that brilliant strategy. And oftentimes it's actually smart. This is a brilliant idea and a thorough analysis. And it really has the potential to change the game for that company. The problem is that communication is an afterthought. And it's sometimes doesn't even exist. It's sometimes delegated to the marketing department to come up with that fancy sounding mission statement. Sometimes it remains just in that huge pile of PowerPoints, which is crafted in consultant jargon, which no one knows what it means for their everyday tasks. And that translation is which often is missing. So what does that mean? That for my job, for the customer representative, for the project manager, for the negotiator, what does it mean?
It's once again, I appreciate that. So in your book, The Path, it's actually an acronym for 4 different concepts. Can you go through what those 4 concepts are for our audience, and then we could start digging into what some of them mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, I really, the first time I recognized this, that concept of the path that we're on with our strategy actually has that those 4 principles in it. That was, well, just a nice moment, and it put a smile on my face when I saw that the first time. So those 4 principles actually they work for strategy, but they are actually much more fundamental for that. I think they apply to many areas of communication. So what are they? P is plain and simple. Can you find plain and simple words that everyone on your team can understand and make sense of? A is actionable. So it's good that they understand it, but are they able to translate it into action? So what does it mean for the everyday actions that I need to take? T is transformative. So actions are good, but we don't want the baby steps. We want the transformative leaps. So do your words encourage those bold moves? And H is heartfelt. Can we find words that the team and us, we all together believe in, truly believe in, about the things we deeply care about? Plain and simple, actionable, transformative, and heartfelt. Get those 4 things right, and I think your chances of making an actual impact with your strategy have just skyrocketed.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm curious, when you've talked about these 4 things with readers, clients, what's the hardest of those 4?
That's an interesting question. So many would say that heartfelt is the hardest. That in a domain that's often concerned with numbers, results, data, that getting over the dry and corporate language to find something that actually has the potential of rallying the team behind, that's the hardest. And it's actually true for many businesses, but that's not universally true, because there's also the other type of business, like the passionate founder, or in the fundraising domain, for example, where it's so much about the cause that they struggle to find the actionable and plain and simple, relatable language. That they have no issue in rallying their team behind the cause, but actually getting them to understand. So, what does it mean for the actions that we need to take so that we can actually advance the cause? That also is sometimes an hard to crack issue. But probably the hardest of all is plain and simple, because somehow it looks like we've been trained to praise and strive for the fancy and eloquent and spectacular sounding language, when in fact it's the plain and simple language that changes the game.
Now, I'm going to ask a kind of a clarifying question on that, because I'm a huge fan of this, and I'm very fortunate to have facilitated in front of many people like you who have PhDs and engineers and academia, and as well as CEOs, you name it, a lot of extraordinary human beings. And what I find often is their language is written in how they think. It's very complex. Like it's like big words. It's grandiose, if you may. And so one of the, I think, most important things is, just like you said, is how do you make these words clear and simple? It's almost embarrassing when I have to tell people who have PhDs, can we make this plain English, right? So people can understand it clearly, but they understand it at its core, right? It's just they kind of have to be called out on it. It's often I'll get this run-on sentence it's not one strategy, it's like 5 different strategies in one sentence. It's not even a clear statement. Mm-hmm. The question here is, and I'm going to use it maybe in terms of a grammar level. You could have college level, if you may. You could have high school level. You can go down to the 8th grade level, or if you may. If you were going to put it in terms of that, how plain language in terms of understanding should we get it?
As low as you can manage. I think that's just the simplest answer to that. So if you recall, or try to think about some of the speeches that you've seen and speakers that have deeply touched you. So who are the ones who really made you light up and really made you feel smart? Was it the ones who found like complex words to explain, to describe their ideas? Was it the ones who were able to juggle eloquent sentences to express simple concepts? Or was it the ones who were able to find the simplest of words for the most complex of ideas, to find the translation from the concepts to the tangible from your everyday life, to make you kind of feel like you're in the center of that thing, and it almost feels like you can touch that concept. And I'd be willing to bet a significant amount of money on that it's the latter, that it's the simple words that made you feel smarter. And I think that's part of the problem, particularly in like you've mentioned PhD a couple of times, right? Particularly in like the research scientific, like academia world, that it's sometimes worn as a badge of honor to be able to use that professional language, to appear as though you are really smart, as though you've really understood those concepts, when in fact, looking from the other side, like from the audience's side, it's really almost always the other way around, that it's the simple language that fascinates them, that it's those rare people who manage to care to find those simple explanations, that everyday metaphors or anecdotes to explain the concept ideas that move you on a deeper level.
It's the great dichotomy, isn't it? Where the irony is, the more clear and simple is what you're saying is the more profound and impactful you can be on a greater and more larger audience. Mm-hmm. It's you and I both have read those really detailed academia documents, and we could read it, but it's not clear and simple, right? When you go through it. But when you have a basic, this is our clear and simple plan of how we're going to change the world.
Yeah.
It then galvanizes. Let's go back to here in the United States when John F. Kennedy said, "We're going to get to the moon in 10 years." Right?
Yeah.
That was a galvanizing, clear vision in simple words. It wasn't this complex, we're going to build all these complex propulsion systems and figure out how to get NASA to launch rocket ships. No, it was, we're going to get to the moon.
Yeah, just think about how that looks in the typical PowerPoint presentation, right? That same message would be what people easily manage to spread that simple message over 30 slides with 6 bullet points each and 15 graphs. And it's totally up to the audience to figure that core message out, right? But Kennedy understood that shouldn't be delegated to the audience. It should be the speaker's task. It should be the leader's task to figure that out.
Yeah, it's the brilliance of simplicity, of when there are extraordinary language. I love that concept around it. And I liked it how you went to that was the most complex, because when I first asked the question, I was thinking it was going to be more heartfelt. But you're right. There are different type of leaders where this is much more easy for them. It's because they are passionate. They actually bring, but then people don't know they'll follow them, but they don't know why. They don't know how, if that makes sense, I should say. They don't know how, right?
Yeah,
exactly. It's probably the right thing to say. Okay, so maybe I could ask a maybe opposite question: which is the easiest of the four for somebody to do in terms of plain, actionable, transformative, and heartfelt?
Well, that's a good question, because it's a tricky one in a way, right? Because some of those concepts can trick you into believing that you've got it figured out when that's not true. Like, for example, the transformative principle, right? Where it's not hard to imagine like stretch goals that you'd want to achieve. But that's only part of the truth, because what you use as a stretch goal when there is no path towards it, right? So you'll definitely need the other principles too. And I think that's what makes this question so tricky, because in the end, it's not about nailing one of those. It's about nailing all four of those. And so they play together. And yeah, it's not about being only transformative. It's being about transformative in a way that we actually can believe in, that we can see how we take action, and that for that we need to be able to translate it into our jobs, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. It's what we say with our principles and our captive strategy method and to 7 principles. And it's like, well, somebody will ask, part of the reason it's almost an unfair question, because like, well, what are one of these 7 things you have to do? It's like, well, do you really want your plan to get fully complete? Well, yes. Then you have to do all 7 principles, right? It's not like this. You can just all of a sudden take the O out of oxygen and think you could still breathe. It's like, you have to do these basic principles, because that's what makes them work. And once again, we could all get along with sometimes things happen, but when you look back, if you go back and go, they still existed. You just maybe didn't know what you wouldn't have. You could look back and like put it and say it did apply. These 7 principles, in your case, these 4 areas did apply, right? That's what made it more powerful and more clear behind the arrangement of it. So we get these 4 principles, and now, and it's interesting. Now you've helped communicate it to people. So how do they? What's a great is when you're going through the process of these 4 key things that you go through, is there a clear implementation of it? So how do we make sure that these 4 parts go through? As you mentioned, is it like we have to have it clear in all 4 of the aspects? All 4, are they more principles, or are they steps in the communication of the strategic plan?
I think it's both. You can look at it both ways. And I think that the best way to look at it is in like a circle, right? That you go through that, and that you shouldn't expect to like go through that once, figure it out once and for all, and then just nail it, right? That's not how communication usually works, because we all fall prey to the curse of knowledge. It all seems to make sense while we're crafting it, but then when we speak to others, they respond with a blank stare. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. That happens to the best. And one of the core principles is here that it's not about being right from the start, but getting it right eventually. And continuously asking those questions along the journey will help you refine it over and over again and finally get it right eventually.
Yeah.
Having said that, I think there is a certain process that will help you get started on that journey. And I think one of the best starting points is actually something that you can do right after this podcast. Walk through your offices, or if you're a remote company, shoot some emails to actual employees, to actual team members, and ask them, what do you think is our strategy all about? What is the core of our strategy? And then just listen to the responses. Don't say a word anymore. Just shut up and listen and collect those words. And almost always you'll be surprised at the range of responses that you get and how different the team thinks about your strategy than what you thought it is. And actually, that's a good add-on. So if a bonus round, if you really get serious about that, before you shoot those emails, write it down yourself. Write down what you think the core of your strategy is, and then compare that. And so the mere fact that this is so different and that the range is so broad is actually not bad news for me. It's actually good news, because it's something to work from. It's something that we now know and that we can start to make sense of. So why does this department think like that? Why does this employee think like that? Where does that come from? Where do we need to adjust? Where is our wording not exactly right? And then asking those 4 principles, those 4 simple questions, will lead you to finally tweak it to a way that you might not achieve 100% alignment, but at least a much higher alignment across the organization.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think it's a great explanation how to get that done. So when organizations apply this and they do it well, what's the long-term benefits of doing that?
I mean, there are tons, right? But I think the most valuable, although it's not one that you directly see, but that you sense when you work in that company, is that you transition from that company who's like that top-down organization with a bottleneck at the top, and the chief executive to have to make all the calls, and have one strategic thinker and an army of soldiers behind them. Have that transition to an organization that's made up of only strategic thinkers, where the whole team is aligned on a common path, and you can fully trust them with making choices in the best interest of the team in their area of influence, and trust them to be actually in the interest of the company. And what that enables is, well, just very widespread, from people showing up with meaningful work, actually smiling at their job, and being passionate about the task that they have to do. But it's of course also just countable things, like hopefully the revenue will go up because everything's aligned in a common direction rather than spread over like 15 different ones. And so I think these are from very intangible things like cultivate a workforce of strategic thinkers, to very tangible things like an increase in bottom line, a much shorter time to market, much less time wasted in meetings discussing and debating over the direction and what it actually means. So that's just priceless.
Absolutely. The leader can take away just one key lesson from the book. What is that?
I'd say it's that if you want your strategy to have an impact, then you need your team to be able to get it, embrace it, and put it into action. And for that, you need to find the right words. That your strategy is not an IQ test. It's not about how intelligent it is, how smart it sounds. It's how actionable it is. And that's directly related to the words that you use to communicate it. And if you use those 4 path principles, plain and simple, actionable, transformative, heartfelt, then you're on a good path to actually making that happen.
I'm curious. You finished, and I know what happened to me. I think when I first finished, I was like, I'll never write a book again. I think that was my first reaction. But then now I want to write 3 more books. Is there a sequel to this? Is something that came through your research and your study that you're like, there's something now else I want to work on and share based on the insights you found from creating this current book?
Actually, what I observe is that this resonates a lot, and that there's a great demand for making this happen in many companies. And so I think a direct derivative of the book is the talks and the workshops that follow from that. And from those, actually a couple of certainly more template like or hands-on and how to style content is certainly to be expected. And actually, parts of this can already be found in the resources page for the book, where I started to create those. I plan to grow that over time. And yeah, who knows? Maybe it ends up in a follow-up sequel to the book. But there are certainly other areas of communication that are worth diving into as well.
And I really liked your answer. I think one of the interesting things is sometimes people don't, when they have a good book like you have created, it's lean into it and help people understand it deeper. And what you shared about that of, hey, this is resonating, Angela Duckworth, the book back here, Grit, right, that I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
you're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
I was just looking back. This it was written back. Okay, let's see if I can find it here real quick here. Forgive me, audience. Um, 2018 looks like. Yeah, 2018, and she still is speaking about it today. Matter of fact, I might be going to a conference here in April where she's going to talk about it again today. And I know she's working on another book. I know she's working on a sequel, but it just shows you the power, right? This is 7 years later, 6, 7 years later, and she's still having an impact with it. And so I encourage you to keep moving with it. It is brilliant. And once again, when you get that book figured out, keep pushing it. Don't be afraid of it being the key book that drives impact, literally. Going back to what you originally created, right?
Yeah.
It is literally
Yeah.
can drive impact. So now I want to now ask a couple of questions. Just got a few more minutes before we have to wrap up. How has this impacted you personally since writing it?
That's a good question. So, first of all, I've really enjoyed that. So, um, unlike many other authors that I've spoken to since, who had many moments where they wanted to throw that out of the window or burn it and just call it a day and get done with it. I just enjoyed every bit of the journey um, in a way that I didn't expect that to be. So even after the actual writing, I mean, as an author, as a published author, that this is just the very first step, and that there are lots of other steps between that and then actually publishing the book. Even those I enjoyed, because the feedback that I got along the way and the learnings that I've drawn out of that, and the discipline that I try to apply to the book with, well, kind of eating my own medicine while writing it. Um, that has certainly provided me with a little more, let's even call it grown up view on the writing that I do in other places, and the
Mm.
way that I speak about my ideas in other places.
Hmm. Yeah, good for you. I think it is always interesting, right? Of when we write something, we're hoping we're following what we wrote, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
part of the integrity of and it is exciting when we know it to be true, but then we consistently follow ourselves, right? That's when it becomes all the more powerful. When you don't just do it in your one book, but you do it as said in everything you do, from your courses and to your, you want to have the same lens, so they're seeing that consistency throughout. And that's what creates a great brand, right? It's because you're no different. You have that same mission throughout everything that you're doing, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's an exciting piece around that. Michael, how can people connect, learn more about you, and potentially buy your book?
Well, easiest way is to head over to my website, michaelgerharz.com, Gerharz, one word, michaelgerharz.com. You'll find pointers to the book, to the blog, to the podcast, and to some free downloads. Um, and of course, the book is easiest to find on Amazon, The Path to Strategic Impact, or just use the pointers on my website. I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn. Just reach out and let's have a conversation.
Okay, so this one of the I'm going to ask something they ask often, and I want to ask it again. Another book. That's not your own book, of course. Is about this whole podcast has really been about your own book. What's a book that really inspired you to write this one?
To write this one,
Mm-hmm.
um, there might be a handful, but one of the early books that made a really profound impact on me was Made to Stick by the Heath brothers,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
where they've analyzed like hundreds of campaigns and looked for what's common for them, and also came up with that brilliant acronym success, which they used to summarize those 6 principles that they found across those principles, across those campaigns. But also certainly like books like Good to Great or so from Jim Collins. That is just a phenomenally well written and well researched book, um, that that has a level of depth to it that's hard to copy.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I have it up here on the top of our bookcase here, because it's it's hard to compete with 10 years of research, right?
Yeah.
Of what they did for that, which is
Mhm.
remarkable. And definitely, once again, if anyone hasn't read Good to Great, it's definitely a must read in terms of your basic
Yeah.
books if you're in business. Uh, Finally, how are you going to measure success with this book and the impact you're having?
Actually, the way I tend to measure success in other areas of my business, I think it would be the best way to measure the success for this book too, and that's the messages that I receive. Like the one that I got 3 weeks ago from that client that I coached 7 years ago in the 3 hour session, and who just to this day continues to thank me for that and how transformational that has been for his journey. Or the message that I received yesterday from a reader of my blog, who told me that this mail just resonated so strongly, and she hopes that it will help her be a leader who lights the path in the new role that she's going to get to be promoted for the new year. And so those messages is what make this journey for me worthwhile. So, or in other words, the potential to actually change people's minds with that. That's how I like to measure success, not exactly in revenue, but in minds changed.
Yeah, yeah, it's and that's a real impact, right? When somebody responds back and said this transformed me or made a change, and so I think it's well said. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Measure podcast today.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.
And to everyone else who's listening, thank you so much for listening to the Measure podcast. I really encourage you to go look at his website, Dr. Michael Gerharz, and he also, as well, has the path to strategic impact. Go to Amazon, buy it, and it's a great book, and it really helped make a difference for what you're trying to accomplish in your organization. And I believe this could also apply to your life as well. These like really simple concepts, but that are simple, but hard to do. And that's what I think what he also brings out through this book as well. And so, as always, it's a pleasure when you read this. We encourage you to like this podcast, subscribe to it, share it with others. That's why we continue to get great guests like Dr. Michael Gerharz. Thank you so much, and wishing you the very best. Imagine your success. Have a great day.